So we're now going to hear Neil Dawson present. So I'm actually sitting a little bit with one of my icons, actually, because I don't think Neil knows this, but he was quite formative in my introduction to public art. I grew up in Wellington, and I remember quite clearly the completion of Civic Square in 1992. It was a significant moment in my understanding of the relationship of public art to the environment and the architecture that surrounds it. Bordered by both the old and new buildings and populated by dramatic and sometimes startling works of art, I remember having strong opinions about the various parts. A year later, City Gallery moved into the now refurbished building that previously held the library, and 5 years later, one could finally wander from the heart of the CBD through Civic Square and across the newly opened to the newly opened Te Papa, which brought with it the collection from the now defunct Dominion Museum and National Art Gallery. There was a sense that Wellington was finally getting its shit together on the artistic front. I think that's been echoed earlier by Hugh. And for me, that feeling in particular was marked by seeing ferns for the first time, which, if you're unfamiliar with it, is a large globe suspended in Civic Square. It's silver on the outside and gold on the inside. I remember the clear double take as I came up over the bridge from the waterfront to see it glimmering in the light. The very improbability of its suspension or evident lack thereof and its seeming fragility. As Peter Leach noted in 1982 about Neil, the object for Neil is not a thing but an experience, the experience of perception itself. The space of Civic Square for me will forever be drawn together and punctuated by ferns. Likewise, my first encounter with Echo in the Arts Centre here in Christchurch is one of those tumbling moments of reflexive self-doubt in the physical act of seeing, where one asks, is it my mind, my eyes, or the object that is wrong? Of course, when we realise how right it all is, when we get it, we realise how right it all is. I'd like you to welcome Neil Dawson here today. Neil.
Thank you very much, Claire. Hi. I hope you don't mind me sitting down. I want to work with actually through the website so I can sort of roam to and fro. Are you able to hear me? Okay. I've been trying to think of some sort of titles for this talk, and actually one of them would be The Art of the Possible. I've always been interested in the art of the possible, whereby you can, and the art of the possible within a public space. And some of the adventures that I've had within public art and how they weave each other from one project to the next project, either through having an experience or meeting certain people that have influenced the way your work's going to go. I've just completed this website, so when you leave you can also look it up. It's just sort of www.neildawson.co.nz, and you can explore the various sort of projects, 50 to 60 public art projects over the last sort of 20 to 30 years. The major thing I don't want to do is to tell you how to do it, because I still don't know. Each project has its own sort of character, its own mood, its own sort of complexities, and the dimensions of the project ultimately will sort of determine the quality of the work. I think the quality of the process that you go through, in the same way that when you're in the studio and you've got all of your paints in rows and your brushes are clean and everything, you feel as though you're in control of the situation. As soon as you go into a public space, all that completely goes out the door. You have to build that confidence for yourself. And that's looking around you, finding all the various parties that you're going to have to work with to actually sort of realise the vision that you've had for a particular space. As I say, there's no rules. It's not I've learned heaps from each project, but they're completely sort of different things. So when you finish a project, you say, okay, that's something that I was never going to do again in my life. But you've learned something. you've learned something about the process or the way to deal with particular people or just funding opportunities or sort of cultural situations. Actually, I'm presently working on a public project which is for the centre of Shanghai, which is for the International Finance Centre there, and it's been an absolutely fascinating process. It's the first time I've worked within sort of mainland China. I've done work in Hong Kong, sort of Japan, also Malaysia, sort of KL and various other parties. But within China, it was, and it was fascinating to hear your talk. It's extremely new to have sort of contemporary art within a public setting. And there was one aspect of the particular project, it went into a big hole for 6 months, and I was talking to the agent saying, what's going on? They said it's gone to the cultural committee. And they had to approve the concept. And I can remember talking with the agent who's based in Hong Kong, although she was educated within Australia. And she phoned me up one day and said, actually, what's the sculpture about? And it's actually a large feather, which continues on a theme which I've been working on for years. And I just said, well, it's just a simple feather that's been scaled up, and it's like it's landing. It's a piece of sort of delicate down. And I could send you some stuff that people have written about feathers, and I said it's about, I mean, they're fragments of something larger. There's something that's very common, so that we all know the experience of walking down the beach and picking up a feather. There's superb little structures if you look inside them, the way the barbs all, and she sort of patiently listened and then said, I think I might know what it's about, she said. And she said, it's about a 2,000-year-old Chinese poem, which is about, it's about the gift of a feather from afar. And I said, that's what it's about. And apparently the gift of a feather, it's a very common poem. I don't know whether you know it, but the idea is that if you're going out for dinner, instead of taking a bottle of wine, if you turn up with a feather, you'll be welcome anywhere in the world. So I just thought, well, here's a little sort of Kiwi land down here. I'm going right into the heart of Shanghai, where all of the financial district is, etc. New Zealand's the first country in the world to have a free trade agreement with China. So I guess why not say it's about that? I don't care. The piece of sculpture is going to work in the way it's sort of going to work, and a hang of a lot of that is beyond my control, and if you're designing art for public spaces, it's beyond your control. So it's really important that you get the ideas yourself sorted out. Excuse me, this is just a few images rolling, and I have to say that I'm frustrated with the fact that this isn't clearer. One of the things that I always sort of say about actually visual artists working as with councils or with other people is that you have to use the strength of your visuals education and the communication that you can have, and this is way too light for you to be able to see it properly, so I'm sorry about that. I don't think we can do anything about it, but I will just jump into my website here, and we'll just scoot into some site works. I just thought I would take you on a small sort of trip through some of these works and how they happened, basically. The piece that I was going to begin with is Echo in the Art Centre, and you see I should be able to find it instantly, and there it is there. Actually, this is the first public artwork that I sort of did, actually, and again, it was a series of temporary installations going on in the North Quad of the Art Centre. It was 1979, 1980, 32 years ago, and the first one was by Lou Summers. He had a large concrete figure which sat in the courtyard. At the time, I was the caretaker in the Arts Centre, and I used to cruise around sort of closing up his doors. I had a studio there, etc. And the North Quad was just this extraordinary space, which I used to see at midnight. And I can remember one night I was doing the rounds, it was around about midnight, and I could hear some, I think it was music. And I went around into the North Quad, and there was a flautist sitting in the middle of the lawn playing a flute, and the sound was just echoing around. And to a certain extent, that's where the title came from. I wanted to create something within that space that sort of didn't dominate the space, but somehow worked in concert with the space, and also changed as you walked around it, so your whole experience of it was actually was a changing experience. And I've told people in the past this sort of story about one day I was walking into the quadrangle there, and there was a kid in a wheelchair, and his mum was sort of pushing him in, and the kid was sort of staring up and said, there's a house in the sky. And it's Mummy, there's a house in the sky. And of course, Mum looked down and said, all right, be quick. Be quiet, kid, we've got to get to ballet, and walked through. And this child, this 3-year-old child, had experienced the sculpture without the parent even seeing it. I've had the Arts Centre say that they've had tourists who have taken photographs of the quadrangle, and then when they got home to Britain, wrote in and said, what's this thing in my photograph? Or taken it back to the chemist because they thought it was a double exposure. So again, I like that idea of being able to go into a space and energize and activate that space in a way that is going to make you remember that space or that experience. There was a mention of ferns before. I've had some fantastic experiences there. Actually, the best one was a friend of mine who was walking through at 2 o'clock in the morning, and he saw this guy with a trench coat and hiding a bottle underneath his arm, and he was sort of staring up there, and he called over my friend. He said, here, and he said, is that really there? Again, am I experiencing this? Now, that's something which sort of doesn't happen when you go into a gallery, and that's what both Louise and also Coralie was saying. The whole idea of the gallery situation is to freeze the experience. We have the lights completely constant, which I've hated. Of galleries, as soon as they got the natural light out of galleries, I wasn't interested in showing in them at all, because it's a dead experience. You have to be quiet, you have to look after the kids so they don't run around and touch things. It's sort of more like going to church than it is going to see art, you know. So the restrictions of the gallery is what really sent me outside. I just thought, hey, life's too short. I want to make some stuff and I want to show it to people. And in the same way that in the same way that a musician wants to have their music heard, artists just want people to see it, just want people to look at it and plug it into their memory banks. And so this was up for 3 months. It was actually commissioned for 3 months. I had a budget of $300, and I can remember being quite excited about that because I hadn't had a budget for a project before that. You can see that I ended up putting things by actually sort of flying as things up in the air. Actually, partly that was because I wanted to have quite a large impact on the space, and I couldn't afford to do a bronze or to do anything like that, so it ended up being fiberglass rod and some really thin wire. So I was particularly impressed with what Coralie was saying about just do it, just go out and do it, because there's a real catch in this business of actually making public art. You can't get invited to make public art until you've done some, and the opposite. You can't experience some until somebody's given you the opportunity to do something on a temporary basis. So I think what's going on in Christchurch is a fantastic opportunity, and it should have been there the whole time prior to the quake, but because the quake's here now, there is the opportunity for people to show things to other people that may be able to influence the powers that be. Although listening to Hugh in the speech, it's a challenge, because we got all of the processes that we had to go through, and if that didn't depress you about being involved in public art, it certainly depressed me. So the whole idea of making art, okay, this began from an invitation. I'll flick back to the next project, which is this one, which I was invited to show at the New York City University. This was, I can't remember the year, it's down the bottom here. It's 1984. And I was given a car park space, which was between 42nd and 43rd Streets. It was huge. It was as big as this, actually. And I didn't have a budget, but I was determined to go there and have a show. And I took a roll of number 8 fencing wire. I literally took the whole show as personal baggage, and I made the whole show either out of number 8 fencing wire or a packaging strip, which you will see in the next piece, and that piece there. Can you see the strip? That's actually sort of steel strapping that they strap crates with. So the edge of those panes of glass there were that, and the rest was number 8 fencing wire. I did 5 large works. This is looking through that one, which is like a set of plumb bobs swinging in space with these ripples coming out of it. So, and in the background are the 2 other pieces. One is made out of steps, and you'll see the link between the piece in the Art Centre and this piece. The one in the Art Centre was made in 1981, and this one was made in 1984. In actual fact, these were fiberglass rods that I just took as a little kit, and they were assembled with little plug joints, and then I hung them up. And I swore that the critics were going to discover me, but they didn't. But I had an amazing experience. It was in the middle of winter. It was January, and I got frostbite because I was working in this space, because the wind blew through from both the ends. And I can remember I was painting things with a spray can, and you'd kind of press and this little sort of piece of chewing gum would come out the end of it because it was so cold to work there. But again, that was that business. I needed to make things that I could show to show people that I could make things. And I wanted some feedback on a level that was beyond here, that was beyond sort of Christchurch. So we'll skip from that project to, and I'm sticking with a kind of a theme here, a piece called Steps, which was outside the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney, which is, I should have had these all. Where is it? Here. Actually, this was a temporary work that was to be suspended outside the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney. I don't know whether you can remember, but Jeff Koons had his big puppy dog made out of flowers outside in that space, and it was a lovely space. And I produced this piece, again, just the simple idea of a set of steps. And it's the idea that you're going somewhere, and I didn't know whether you were going up or coming down, but it was that idea of engaging people in a very common process, which they do each day, but to think about it. And when you think about the religions that exist all around the world, they all have a stairway to heaven somewhere in their mythology. So that idea of being able to engage with the stairway to heaven, you've got sort of Led Zeppelin to Muslim to whatever. So this was a temporary work. It was up for about 6 months. I'll just show you a couple more pics. That's it looking into the front Oh, dear me, I hope you can see these images. It's not great. They look way better on my computer. It was also something that could be seen with a variety of backdrops. So that experience of walking around something, you're basically experiencing the space rather than experiencing the sculpture. I find that with the majority of my sculptures, they're an excuse to look at the sky or to experience. And when people describe my sculptures with ferns, they come up. I saw ferns in Wellington the other day. It was amazing. The rain was coming down and the sleet and the light was shining through the rain. And they're describing the day. They're not describing the sculpture. It can go from a pencil drawing on a grey sort of cloudy day to screaming at you when you've got a bright blue sky. So that is something that can't happen inside a sort of a gallery setting. You can also see it when you're pissed. You generally don't go to a gallery when you're pissed, but when you're pissed after you've had a night out in a restaurant and you're walking home through Civic Square, you're in a different mood and you see it there and you remember that mood, you know. So again, it's about the real experience that you have of life. It's of life. It's not something that's about life. So with these, there was a couple of actually Chinese businessmen of KL when they were rebuilding the centre of KL within Malaysia. And they flew to Sydney and they were going to Darling Harbour to check out what's hot and what's not. And they went to the MCA and they saw the piece of sculpture sort of hanging up in the sky. And they went into the foyer and asked who was that piece of sculpture by, because we really like it. And there was nobody in the gallery could tell them who it was. So they went away and they actually found me through a landscape architect who had gone through Lincoln University, who happened to know something that I'd seen here. And they phoned me up and they flew me to KL. And I'll go back to... So these sort of steps are beginning to build a little bit here. And what I find is that when you go into Asia, what I'm constantly expecting from people here is that they want you to do something that they haven't seen before. But when you go to Asia, they want to see something that they have seen before. So the idea of an original idea is not quite so much part of their culture as it is with ours. So they really loved the staircase thing, and I just took it and went for a ride. This is called Vanishing Stairs. Again, just revisited the same sort of concept. As you can see, it's within the middle of an urban setting. It's a huge courtyard with sort of gardens and a fountain, and this is a 20-metre sort of suspended structure that goes from appearing quite solid at the bottom and it vanishes into the sky as you go up. With each one of these projects, I could actually talk for an hour about the logistics and the politics and the dangers of trying to build things like this in the middle of Malaysia, but I won't. And then they told me that the space at night was going to be used as a sort of a hub. So they had a garden there, and the whole of the ground floor was going to be rented out to restaurants and sort of cafes and bars and things like that. So I thought about the nighttime experience. And that's the great thing about being able to do public art, is that you can have all of these different moods that it will go through, sort of actually during the day and the night. And with this one, we set up 4 towers with just small sort of coloured lamps, and there's a 20-minute cycle of just sort of slowly changing colour, and it will change from that kind of coloration into a sort of a green and gold, and then so it's sort of like a disco in funny ways, but the whole of KL sort of felt like a disco at that time. And I was fascinated And as a result of that particular project, I was invited to do some more projects in KL, and one of them was, this is titled Butterflies, and of course you know that Malaysian butterflies are absolutely extraordinary. I ended up taking actually 3 of the common types of Malaysian butterfly, sort of scaling them up to about 5 meters and suspending them up in the air like sort of stained glass windows, so that they were backlit, so that at night they would illuminate themselves. Actually, this was in sort of Kui of the Twin Towers, which were being built at the same time. And since then, no, this is a permanent installation. In fact, all of these ones in KL were permanent. And again, all pretty much for the same sort of client, who was Filio Bank. There was one other one which I did in sort of KL, which was called Leaf Sphere, which you could easily say I just led on to Chalice, from the point of view that it was these were the tropical leaves of Malaysia, actually built into a sphere and suspended. Again, I mean, the way I do things is to find out what's sort of common, basically. I'm just trying to use the common things in an uncommon way, to see them from a different perspective. As you can see, the practicalities of this just bolted together. I think we had about a day to build and install this, so it went over as a kit set. I generally don't build things overseas. I build them here and put them into a shipping container and take them over and join them up and assemble them on site. And also, here's a local who was helping us out. You can see that they just basically bolted to each other. So the practicalities of having to build things here and of transport them actually became part of the projects, and an exciting part of those projects. We could jump from there to Chalice, which has survived very well. As you can see, it's sort of lost its best friend, which was the cathedral spire, and I hope to be able to, I hope that'll come back, quite frankly. That was one of the things about Chalice, is I always see when I go into a site, you sort of have to key the work into that site somehow, and I mean, basically, so that's Chalice and that's the cathedral spire, and you can take lots of meanings from that. I'm trying to create a sort of a spiritual experience, or something that would actually sort of lift your spirits. But of course, the steeple is the one way, and that's heaps of ways, and I think that's one more. The fact that you've got the tension going on between those two things, I consider that's what was sort of unique about Cathedral Square. I don't think the church particularly was, but the combination of the two of them was something that held itself to that space, because that actually doesn't exist elsewhere. That is a unique experience, and I think that's what you're trying to do with public art, is to make a unique experience for people. I won't go into the complexities of sort of doing Chalice, but it was a fantastic experience. Actually, Blair talked about the memorial aspect of art. This is basically what this was. The brief that I had was to do something that was going to commemorate the 150th anniversary of Christchurch, of the province of Canterbury. And as you can see, the leaves are from the specific ecology that was in the square prior to settlement. So I went back thousands of years when the square actually was a forest before it was actually smitten by the Waimakariri, which moved from the south of Banks Peninsula to the north of Banks Peninsula and actually took out the trees. So the trees that went were actually the height of Chalice, and the leaves are from those particular leaves. So even now, if you go down into the square, there are stumps from totara trees that are down there now. So again, in the same way that I tried to make something that looked back but also looked forward, and you'll probably perhaps know the experience that for 2 years there was all kinds of crap going on about Chalice, that it was going to be taller than the cathedral, and it was going to be an eyesore, and it should be made out of stone, and a prominent architect referred to it as a flue to an underground toilet. So there's the professional support you get. I decided throughout that whole process that I wouldn't actually respond, because I was still in the process of building the sculpture. And of course the sculpture went up within 5 days of it being unveiled. The planes went into the Twin Towers and it became a shrine overnight by just one woman who happened to be an expat who owned a flower shop in the square. She put one bunch of flowers there, and within a couple of days it was surrounded with flowers. Again, public art has absolutely no sort of function, but there it found a function, because there would be quite a few people who wouldn't put flowers in front of either a war memorial or in front of a church, but somehow they felt all right about putting it in front of that. Also, what they created by the design of the sculpture was a sort of a wreath that went around the base of it, and it also sort of collected people in a group whereby they were all standing, sort of looking at each other and just reading each other's messages. So it was the village pump. It became a place for people to meet. And I must admit, when that happened, my heart just went boom, 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 and I went to the rest of you regarding all of the crap that was going down. And of course there was no reason to talk about it then, because the sculpture was there. So I think that brings up one point, and I was going to get onto this, is some of the advice as to how you should sort of deal with public art projects. And I have made a few notes here, but I'll just sort of do it off the top of my head. One thing, actually one rule, is that I never talk about the idea to people. You show them the idea. If you talk about the idea, they go off, they design it, they visualize what it's going to be like. You go off and you change your mind and you feel really bad because you told them that it was going to be this, and oh crap, so do I have to do that because I told them, or do I, It's like a novelist talking about their book before they've finished it. You don't talk about it. You've got a germ, you've got a very sort of delicate seed, which is just a whim. Quite often it begins with a whim. With this one, actually with Chalice, it was the idea of, I thought it would be great if I could build something like the Nor'wester had come into the square and he was whipped up with the leaves and sort of made a vortex of leaves. Simple. But if I had have described that to somebody before I sort of designed it, I would have gone off, done all the hard work, talked to my structural engineers and worked out the finances and all those kind of things, and I would have come back and shown them and I'd say, oh, I didn't think it would be like that. I thought it would be like this. And they get their pen out and they start to show you how they thought it was going to be. And of course you've lost all of the power that you had. The power you have is the idea. And you own the idea until somebody else is going to own it. Sure, you can talk with friends, you can show friends, perhaps there might be somebody actually within that process, and the more experienced I get, the more I can judge the people who I can talk to ideas about. And I have to say that Hugh Nicholson is somebody that I have been prepared to talk about, because I think he has made things happen. and I think he understands the artistic process. But there are lots of people who don't. The other thing that can happen when you show people an idea, especially when it's sort of like a group of people, like a committee or the Arts Advisory Committee or the Sculpture Trust or some of these places, that when you talk about what you're going to do, they love to get involved. They'd love to be party to this because that's why they go on to these things, because it's fun and it's sort of creative and we're all going to have fun and we're all going to design this thing. And sometimes they want to see two ideas, and if you showed them two ideas, they'd say, we want that, but we want it the colour of the other one. Or they'll want to say, yes, we like those, but why don't you show us a third idea? You know, and all of this is really a sort of an abuse, I find it, an abuse of the process of creating art. And so basically when you go into a public contest, you have to say, I have to pretend that I'm in my studio, and I hate it when people come through and I'm halfway through a painting. You know what it's like, it's terrible. So you have to protect the process that you're going through. You also have to sort of create an environment for them to be surprised, and what I would sort of tell them is that I can't surprise you until I can surprise myself. Now, for me to surprise myself, I have to do a hell of a lot of hard work. I have to spend a hell of a lot of time with the site, I have to photograph it, I have to research it, I have to do sketches, I have to throw things around the studio, and this is going to take several months. Generally, I'd say 3 months is what I asked for. But quite often, the approach is the fact that the Arts Advisory Committee have been talking about this project for 2 years, and then they say, right, we're going to do it. Let's get the artists in, or several artists, and we'll pay them a couple of grand, and they can go off and sort of do these things. And you don't want to give them too much time because, you know, these artists, they'll probably procrastinate, etc. So you've only got a month to come up with the idea. And that's so common. And it assumes that the artist hasn't got a job. It assumes that that this is the only project that the artist is working on, and that they can just suddenly sort of drop things because the committee has decided, holy shit, we've been working on this for years, we haven't got a result yet, we've got to get the artist to do it. Okay, when that happens, I just say, I'm sorry, I can't be involved. You have to protect the integrity of the processes that you are going through to create something new. And it is, you're creating something new, and you need time. I mean, the other thing is the money. There's a common thing now whereby you would ask 4 or 5 artists or teams of artists and engineers and architects to do these things, and we'll give you $3,000 or something like that, which is really just going to pay for the photocopying and for the colour and for the computer-generated imagery that you're going to. In terms of your time, you can flag it away. You have to accept the fact that you're going to steal time to create these things. With some jobs, for example, I will go back to here very quickly. We got up to about 1984, which seems like a century ago. There was one extraordinary project that I got invited to do, which is an exhibition. The title was Magicians de la Terre, which was held at the Pompidou Centre in 1989, and it was a key exhibition whereby artists from all around the world were invited. Up until then, the contemporary art world was basically the States and Europe, and with this one show, Jean-Hubert Martin was the curator. We used to call him Johnny Bear because it was easy to remember the accent. He set out to put together a worldwide exhibition, and he sent his curators. One of them was, and this young curator, André Magnan, was sent off into the third world. He said, you go to Greenland and find an Eskimo bone carver, you go to Haiti and find a voodoo artist, you find African women who paint their houses, and why don't you pop down to little old New Zealand and see what's going on down there? So I sneaked into the show via the back door as part of the third world, basically. Andre came to New Zealand. He didn't go to the Arts Council. He didn't go to the galleries. He went to Auckland and he went to the pub. And he asked who were the artists around town. And then he somehow came down to Christchurch. Echo was in the Arts Centre, the only public art work that I had. He saw that. I showed him a piece called Horizons, which is now up on the Gibbs farm, which I actually designed in 1982, and said, wow, these look quite interesting. So he said, why don't you come over to Paris and we can see what we can do. So at that stage, you don't talk about fees or anything like that. I found the money for the airfare. I flew off to Paris. I sort of met with Andre and with sort of Jean Hubert. They took me up to La Villette, which was one of the venues for the exhibition, which was it was meatworks. And they asked me they thought I could suspend something up in the air in front of La Villette. And I sort of looked at La Villette and said, oh no, this is a train ride out of town. I said, I'd like to put something up in the air outside the Pompidou Centre, if that's all right with you. And they just looked at me and said, impossible. And as soon as I heard that, I thought, we're going to do this. And somehow we did. Yes, we missed the opening. So we were there about 4 or 5 days after the opening, because when we got there, I could write a book about this project, and I won't actually bore you with it, but it was funded by the Arts Council, which is now sort of Creative New Zealand, and by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and also the Pompidou Centre. And I think we had $60,000, and there was $20,000 from each of those. It was a pretty tight budget, but again, it was something that I felt as though I could work with. The day before actually the Globe was going to leave Christchurch, I got a call from actually from Paris saying that you can't install the sculpture yourself. It has to be installed by a French engineering company, and that'll cost you $30,000. And so at that stage I went through to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and to the Arts Council and said, look, I've got the money from the Pompidou Centre in my account. They'd given me 15 grand. I said, what say we go back to them and say, thank you very much for the contribution to the sculpture, and we'll send you some photographs when we've found a suitable place to install it. And they came back and said, it's no problem, no problem. You come to Paris, you bring sculpture to Paris, we sort out, etc., etc. And we got there and we found that the local prefecture of the police hadn't been told about it, so we weren't allowed to hang it there. We had to get authorizations, we had to use a certain thickness wire that had to be purchased from a certain man in the car park of the Pompidou Centre after dark. There was all kinds of things went down. And then I used one of my clients, which was the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I remember there was a Saints' Day in Paris, which is every third weekend. You have a Saints' Day and all the banks are closed and everything's closed. And I can remember I couldn't phone the New Zealand embassy, so I went to the New Zealand embassy in Paris and I stood outside and I waited until somebody came to the door, and the cleaner came to the door, and I said, actually there was a woman in charge there by the name of Judy Trotter, and she was a really wonderful woman. And I said, look, I'm an artist from little old New Zealand, and I can't ring the embassy because nobody answers the phone. They say, if it's an emergency, please please leave a message and we'll be back to you in 3 days. So I told the cleaner to tell sort of Judy that I was outside and that I wanted to talk to her. And she went in, sort of Judy came down, she invited me in, we went in, and within 24 hours we were sort of toasting the return of the earth with the head of the police, and we were opening a bottle of champagne and sort of toasting this piece, and it came back because it was a political issue. It was 6 months after the Rainbow Warrior Affair. There was sensitivities going on there, and we took advantage of all of those, and the piece happened. I'll just add one other little thing about politics and also the Globe project. I can remember when I was invited to go to the show, to be in the show. That's it, looking down on it over the plaza. I was really pissed off about the French because they were bombing the Pacific and they were testing and things, and they were sinking ships up in Auckland and God knows what. And I remember thinking at the time, I know what I'll do. I'll boycott the show. That'll show them. And I went, yeah, right. And I thought it was a really good example, and it's the same thing that I've done in sort of KL and also China. I'm doing public works in China now because it's a way of making a physical engagement with people. And I thought, I know what I'll do. I'll take the globe of the earth, around the earth, I'll hang it up in the air to show the French how large the Pacific is when you look up on it. And ultimately, that's what the piece did. It was also a sort of a literal sort of globe of the earth, but it was also based on the satellite images of the world as seen from outer space, and I can remember, I think it was 1988, a very similar image of this was on the cover of Time magazine, as if it was the image of that time, of the end of the 80s. We were suddenly outside ourselves, sort of looking back. And then of course Globe from there, it was up there for 9 months. The exhibition only went on for 3 months, but the piece of sculpture was up there for 9 months. There were postcards being sold in the square which just said, the title was La Sphere. There was no name of the artist, there was nothing. And I came home to Christchurch and I found out there were more people from Christchurch had seen my work in Paris than had seen my show that I just had in a gallery here, because that's where people in Christchurch went to see art, you know. So that was one of the situations where I just had to sort of go for it. The piece ended up being purchased by the National Gallery of Australia. It was hung outside the gallery there. It was sort of destroyed in a storm. Some people said I was struck by lightning, and I love that idea, and I'm not going to deny it. And then they commissioned me to sort of do it again. I said, no, I don't want to do it again. It was first done as a temporary installation, so they commissioned me to do a brand new work that was on the same sort of scale and was suspended up there, and the title of that, and that is the new piece. The title is Diamonds. It's exactly the same size, but it's based on satellite images of the Australian sort of landscape and was made out of mesh. That's it. At night, you can see it was just sort of crumpled mesh of a topographical sort of nature. I'm going to come to an end very shortly and answer questions because I don't know whether I'm heading where you want me to head. There's a chain of ideas that are just constantly rolling in the way that I design my work. And what I want to say to the people here is, I thought sort of Coralie's talk was absolutely right on the button. You just have to do it. You do it. You don't wait to be asked. I mean, this idea of making it within the arts, it's literally that. You have to make it. Somebody's not going to come along and tell you that you've made it. You physically make it. All of these works, I didn't have the budget at the time to do them. I went in there, I played around. I began to build up a network of people. That was the other thing that sort of Louise was talking about. Structural engineers, I have to employ them because I'm hanging things over the public's head. They have to be safe. I use a lawyer because the contracts are really important. I can remember I went to a conference years ago, something similar to this, and there was an item on contracts, which I believe that sort of Deborah and a lawyer are going to be doing. And the title of it was, "A contract means that you never have to say you're sorry." And that's absolutely right. It's not about a piece of paper, it's about an agreement that you've actually negotiated, okay, with the client. The hard thing when you're dealing with art, and it's a business mantra, is that you have to identify your client before you can do any business. Now, as you could see with what Hugh put up on the board there, who is the client in there? Is it the councillors? Is it the public of Christchurch? And I'd say it's the public. So you have to be responsible to them ultimately, but to achieve that, you have to negotiate your way through all kinds of aspects of these projects. And I've spent a lot of money with lawyers who have been really helpful and incredibly generous too, because they can, in trying to come up with a format that is going to suit both parties, is going to work for the client, but is also going to work for the artist. And I found out that seeing I'd done 50 projects, I sort of knew a bit more than the clients because they hadn't have done that before. You have to deal with the financial aspects of your work. So budgets, one of the other aspects of public art that I'm very interested in is that people understand budgets, they understand sort of costs, and sometimes the costs aren't just financial, they're personal, and sometimes the costs are more than the budget. The one thing that absolutely nobody talks about is the value of public art, and it's still not appreciated. I would talk about somebody else's work, but for example, Chalice, I think, earns the city money every day. There are people taking photographs of it and taking it home. It's on trucks, it's on super value ad, it's on, pack and save ads. I saw a little triangle with 3 triangles taken out of it, and I thought, oh, that's my sculpture. And then I thought, well, that's cool that you can actually have something, a symbol like that, that suddenly you're able to sort of recognise. I don't earn a dime off it. There are postcards being sold, and I don't care, because if you're going into the public sphere, you have to be prepared to sort of give your work into an environment, and it's going to build its own life. I'll stop there and ask if there's any questions, because I think I've probably gone on. Or are you happy to a bit longer? I think it might be a good time to ask some questions, because there's 50 projects here, and if there's any particular one you want to talk about, or part of the processes. Yes.
Out of all the projects you've worked on, what do you think your greatest challenge overall, or the biggest challenge that's common amongst challenges you have?
It's the most common of challenge. The constant challenge you have the whole time is the protection of the idea. You have to somehow set up a process where you're not going to be compromised. And you have to remember that it's your work. The people on the committees, who remembers them? The city council, who remembers them? I've got my name on the bottom of Chalice that says it's got my signature, so therefore I have to be able, and I want to stay sort of living in Christchurch. I don't want to leave, because it's sort of, and there's a famous old sort of story about young architects have to they end up quite often sort of leaving towns where they did all their experimental houses in because they can't live with them. So that they are going to be out there. I think the other challenge is to design something which is going to stay fresh, that's not going to be able to be vandalised and is going to be maintained. I don't think people know, but with Chalice, as part of the negotiation before Chalice went in there, I had a contract that said that it was going to be maintained, and it cost $15,000 a year to maintain Chalice. That's not high when you think about what it costs to clean the civic buildings, which they do every night. They go in there are hordes of people go in there and clean them. Somehow, art is supposed to look after itself. And so when you're going in, when the brief comes out, maintenance is the most important thing, is that it has to not have to be maintained. And that's ridiculous that that's the case. So again, the negotiation, putting in situ the protections that your work is going to have. On a physical level, hanging something in front of the Pompidou Centre was a bit of a task, And I can remember I limped out of there. I was a wreck. I was an absolute wreck. But I had some good friends who came with me, and I was 34 years old and had lots of energy and was prepared to go for it. But also not prepared to compromise. Okay, when the police said we weren't allowed to put it up, I had huge pressure from the Pompidou Centre to put it in a courtyard on the top floor of the Pompidou Centre. I don't know whether you've been there, but there are these sort of tanguli sort of sculptures up there, and they had a little space about the size of this, and we could hang it over there, and you would make the opening ceremony and everything would be cool. And I just said, nah, I wasn't going to go there. And it's so easy to say, yeah, well, I have to show it because these people have put the money in. The opening's coming. There are all these sort of curators from all around the world. I'd love them to see it. But I thought, what am I going to be telling them? I'm going to be telling them that it was going to be a really good, exciting project. And we've got it here, And it was only when I said, it's when you completely sort of give up and say, all right, crap, it's over, I'm not prepared to do it. That's when people get on board and start to solve problems for you, as opposed to you constantly saying, oh, that's right, because I'm just a little artist, and artists aren't really important in the scheme of things. And that's why I have to say that as part of what Hugh was saying, I was very disappointed to hear the attitude that artists can't be involved with these major projects of redevelopment in the city here, that he just can't see the opportunity for them. It's essential that artists are involved in those things. I haven't been invited. I have to say, until Hugh came to town, there wasn't a single person from the city council had been in my studio for 25 years. The director of the City Gallery, Tony Preston, was the chairman of the Art and Public Places committee. I was doing public art all around the world. He didn't contact me. He never came to my studio. So the fact that and I could get angry and pissed off and say grumpy, but that's not going to help. You go where the opportunities are and you show people what you can do. I can remember, it's within the New Zealand context, and in actual fact, probably the first public works that I've ever done, I've got them here actually, they're called house alterations, and they were works about this big. And they were public from the point of view that they had a public psychology. They were about sort of common things and trying to engage people. And from that came echo and various other things. So I was also interested with Blair. There's heaps of things just rolling into my mind. He said art in public places and public art. Now, I'm fascinated in the difference between those two things. And I think there probably is a difference between those things. I think public art has to take on, it's not plonking a piece of art within a public place and seeing how things happen. It's about the artists engaging actually with the public. One rule that I have is that I don't want to, what's the word? I don't want to offend anybody with my art, okay? And that's different to doing what people tell you to do. I think you do have to retain your own ideas about, and again, chorally, the subversive nature, the sort of the guerrilla aspect of art, I think can happen in structured jobs too. I tell you, there are some people, the committees don't really know what you're up to. Sometimes you can slip ideas through. I can remember I did one in front of a bank in Wellington called The Rock, which was, it was done during the 1980s, and it really came about from the fact that banks constantly put these huge rocks outside their front doors to show how solid they were. And I can remember it was at the time that the BNZ was just sort of bailed out. I put a rock in front of there, but it's a drawing of a rock. It's an ethereal rock. It's something that, and I couldn't believe that I was able to get away with that. When I was putting in sort of chalice, there were some people writing to the newspaper saying that it's the work of the devil because it's the spire upside down. Again, it's kind of doing that, but it's also doing other things, and you can talk through your work without having to explain it all to people. I would just like to show one more work which could potentially come to Christchurch. Well, it's in Christchurch, actually. It's a piece called Fanfare. And to show you how public artworks can happen. This is, again, I wish you could see things properly. Actually, 5 months before as New Year's Eve, I was invited to do something which they call the bridge effect, which is every New Year's Eve in Sydney, they commission an artwork for the Sydney Harbour Bridge, which is part of the celebrations of New Year's Eve, and it stays up for 3 weeks. I was approached by a guy by the name of Leo Schofield, who was a food critic and an arty man. He's got his own sort of TV show on art, etc. And he approached me to make a mirror ball because they had tried to design a mirror ball for the bridge, which really fits in with the sort of the party, the hero parade and the whole sort of gay, disco thing that goes down in Sydney. And I thought, well, yeah, all right. So you want to design are you sure you want a mirror ball? You know, and it was 5 months before New Year's Eve, and I did a Picture Kucha presentation on this a few years ago. Of course, 5 months is a very short time to actually design and build something. With the help of an engineer friend of mine who happened to be living in Sydney, we designed a 20-metre diameter sphere, which that's probably 8 metres to the top there. So if you think the sphere would fill this whole space, and it's got 360 pinwheels on it that move with the wind, and they're made out of stainless steel. We floated it in on a barge just before midnight, and we hauled it up on a crane. We put a crane boom out from the top of the Sydney Harbour Bridge, and we hauled it up there, and then the light show began, and there were flashing lights and lights screaming over the top, and then the fireworks came up, and it remained there for 3 weeks. That's as it's seen from the bridge. again, the opportunity to do something in an environment like this, which are the paired icons of the world. I think the Sydney Harbour Bridge and the Sydney Opera House, what an environment. I think it's just fabulous. So to be able to do something, however temporary, I just had to have a go, you know. There's some incredible stories about how things happened. Yeah, that shows you the full size of structure. Actually, one of them, which I'll tell you very briefly, is... Okay. I will just tell you this one story. Because I wasn't building it, you have to protect what it's going to look like. So I went over there on the basis that I said, before it goes public, I want to see it. I want to see it constructed, and I want to see the fans made. And I knew that the engineering had been left for the production of the steel sort of model, but somehow the council were trying to build the fans themselves, and they had a project manager, and they had a tent down on the wharf, and I went in there to see it. They were going to be launching the following day. I flew in. I said, before you launch it, I have to say that it's okay. So I went down to the wharf. I saw the chaos that was going on down there, where they were making them out of mirrored polystyrene. Do you know that thin stuff that's like mirror? And they were weak, and they were just going to all fall apart, and God knows what. So I saw them in the morning. We were having a meeting that night, and it was going to be launched the following day. I thought, holy shit, what am I going to do? I went back to the hotel. I got out the yellow pages. I found the stainless steel suppliers within the country. I designed them on pieces of paper I didn't have a pair of scissors, I didn't have a knife, I didn't have a ruler, but I somehow worked out, okay, the number of sheets that I was going to need, and I found out that in actual fact, in the scale of things, it was only 20 grand for the material, and that I worked out that you could save half of the material by making it out of 4 pieces and various other things. I found the suppliers. I found that they were the only place that had it in town, because we needed to get it quickly because things were going to happen. I went along to the meeting that night, but I found out that in the time that I was in my hotel, I noticed that the weather was really bad outside. And then I finally went on to TV and found out that a weather bomb had hit Sydney, and 5 planes were sort of grounded, and that what had happened down on the wharf, the storm had picked up the tent and all of the plastic fans and blown it into the harbour. And of course my meeting came up that night, and I came up with the solution. I said, oh, there's no problems with that, we'll go ahead. And we launched it the following day, and they were all made out of stainless steel, and it happened. So sort of chance, sort of serendipity, but hard work. You have to roll with the punches. When things go wrong, you have to work out how you can get out of there to solve those problems. Okay, I've finished. Have you got any questions?
Thank you very much for being here this afternoon, guys. My takeaway from that is that there's always negotiation in public art, but it doesn't necessarily mean compromise. So you need to think about a lot of the things that Neil's brought up today as potential pitfalls and maybe problems and areas of negotiation that you need to think about in advance. What's my position on this? If I get asked to do this, what's my position?
Yeah.
So.
Yep. And you can be strong. It's about your vision. It's not about, okay, don't do what other people tell you to do, because if somebody comes to me and asks me and tells me what to do, I just say, go off and build it. You don't need me. I just employ somebody to build it. It'll be a lot cheaper and a lot more hassle. I'm really tricky to work with because I want to do my idea.
Thank you, Neil, for your presentation.
Cheers.
Enjoy seeing you guys back.